You know that friend who quit their corporate job to join a hot new startup? The one who couldn't stop talking about ping pong tables, unlimited vacation, and how they were going to change the world while getting rich off equity? Yeah, well, they're probably updating their resume right now. I'm incredibly fascinated by this whole startup obsession we've created. Maybe you are too. You clicked this video because something feels off about all the hype, and honestly, you're right to be suspicious. Everyone's been sold this dream that startup jobs are the golden ticket to career success, work-life balance, and financial freedom. But here's the thing nobody wants to talk about. It's mostly bullshit. The startup job market in 2025 is absolutely brutal, and I mean that literally. We're looking at numbers that would make your guidance counselor cry. New grad hiring at startups has collapsed by 30% compared to pre-pandemic levels. 30%. That's not a dip, that's a crater. Startups now make up under 6% of new hires, and it's getting worse every month. But this isn't just some temporary market correction. This is a fundamental shift in how the entire startup ecosystem operates, and nobody prepared you for what that actually means for your career. Let me paint you a picture of what's really happening out there. Series A. Tech startups are 20% smaller than they were in 2020, 20% fewer people doing the same amount of work. And before you think this is just about efficiency, remember that these companies are still trying to grow at breakneck speed. So what does that mean for you? It means you're not just doing your job anymore. You're doing 1.5 jobs, maybe 2, and you're supposed to be grateful for the opportunity. The whole promise of startup life was that you'd grow with the company, right? Start as a junior whatever and work your way up to senior whatever as the company scales. Except here's a stat that'll blow your mind. 72% of executive roles at startups are filled externally. 72%. That means when your startup finally gets big enough to need real leadership, they're not promoting you. They're hiring someone from Google or Facebook who already has the experience they need. And this creates this weird paradox where startups sell you on growth opportunities while simultaneously ensuring you'll never actually get them. It's like being promised a seat at the captain's table while the ship is actively recruiting new captains from other ships. The financial reality is even more devastating than the career stuff. Founder salaries have dropped 43% in just the last year. If the people who literally own the company are taking massive pay cuts, what do you think is happening to employee salaries? Most startups are now offering base salaries that are 20 to 50% lower than market rate. 20 to 50%. And they make up for it with equity, which sounds great until you realize that 90% of startups fold within 3 years. So let's do some quick math here. You take a job that pays you significantly less than you could make elsewhere, and in exchange, you get a lottery ticket that has a 10% chance of being worth something and a 90% chance of being completely worthless. Oh, and you also get to work longer hours in a more stressful environment with less job security. What a deal. Speaking of job security, let's talk about the layoff crisis that nobody wants to acknowledge. In 2025 so far, we've already seen over 81,000 people laid off from startups and tech companies. That's almost 500 people per day losing their jobs, every single day. And these aren't just struggling companies making tough decisions. These are well-funded startups with big-name investors who are conducting their second or third round of layoffs in the span of a few months. The pattern is crystal clear. Startups hire aggressively when money is cheap, then cut aggressively when reality sets in. You're not building a career, you're riding a roller coaster that mostly goes down. But here's where it gets really insidious. The startup world has created this mythology around failure that makes all of this seem normal. They've convinced an entire generation that getting laid off is just part of the journey, that bouncing between companies every 18 months is somehow good for your career development. They've gamified instability and called it growth. The work-life balance promises are equally fraudulent. Remember when startups bragged about unlimited vacation? Well, studies show that employees at companies with unlimited vacation policies actually take less time off than those with traditional policies. It's psychological manipulation disguised as a benefit. When there's no structure, people feel guilty taking any vacation at all. And those flexible work arrangements? They're flexible in one direction. Sure, you can work from home, But you're also expected to be available at all hours. You can set your own schedule as long as you're willing to work nights and weekends when something needs to ship, which, in a startup, is always. The entrepreneurial lifestyle that gets romanticized in tech media is actually pretty horrifying when you look at the data. The average entrepreneur gets 3.5 hours of sleep per night and works 12.5 hours per day during their first year. They gain 80 pounds, develop anxiety disorders, and crush energy drinks to power through marathon work sessions. This isn't inspiration porn. This is a health crisis. But somehow, this has become the aspirational lifestyle for an entire generation of workers who think that suffering for your job is noble, and that work-life balance is for people who lack ambition. The AI revolution has made all of this exponentially worse. Companies are realizing they can replace entire departments with software, and they're not being subtle about it. Why hire 3 people when GPT can do most of the work in one prompt? Why have a whole marketing team when you can have one person with really good AI tools? This isn't some distant future scenario. This is happening right now, and startups are leading the charge because they don't have the institutional inertia that bigger companies do. They can pivot quickly, which sounds great until you realize that pivoting often means pivoting away from human employees. The venture capital funding environment has created this perfect storm of unrealistic expectations and unsustainable business models. When money was cheap and investors were throwing cash at anything with a .com in the name, startups could afford to be wasteful. They could hire aggressively, offer competitive salaries, and promise the moon to anyone willing to join their rocket ship. But that party is over, and the hangover is brutal. Venture funding has dried up by over 60% compared to peak levels, and the startups that survived are operating in pure survival mode. They're not thinking about your career development or work-life balance. They're thinking about making their cash runway last another 12 months. This creates a toxic dynamic where employees are expected to be grateful for the opportunity to work harder for less money with zero job security. And if you complain or ask for reasonable working conditions, well, there are 10 other people who would kill for your job. It's emotional manipulation disguised as corporate culture. The networking events and industry conferences are particularly nauseating. You'll sit through panel after panel of successful entrepreneurs talking about their journey, and they'll conveniently skip over the part where they laid off half their team or the time they went 6 months without paying themselves. They'll talk about pivoting and iterating like these are positive things, when in reality, pivoting usually means your original idea was garbage, and iterating means you're desperately trying different things until something sticks. And let's talk about the equity conversation, because this is where the manipulation gets really sophisticated. They'll sit you down and explain how your equity could be worth millions if the company gets acquired or goes public. They'll show you calculations and projections that make it seem like you're basically guaranteed to become wealthy. What they won't tell you is that your equity is probably worth less than the paper it's printed on. Here's how equity actually works in most startups. You get a tiny percentage of a company that's worth nothing, with multiple liquidation preferences that ensure investors get paid first. And even if the company does get acquired, your shares might get diluted so much that your payout is essentially pocket change. It's like being offered a slice of a pie that doesn't exist yet, and even if it eventually gets baked, you'll probably get the crumbs. The psychological manipulation extends to the company culture too. They'll use words like family and mission and changing the world to make you feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself. But families don't conduct quarterly layoffs, and missions don't usually involve optimizing click-through rates on display ads. The open office concept that every startup loves is actually a perfect metaphor for the entire industry. It sounds great in theory, collaborative and transparent and egalitarian, but in practice it's a nightmare. You can't concentrate, you can't have private conversations, and you're constantly distracted by other people's meetings and phone calls. But nobody wants to be the person who complains about it because that would make you seem like you're not a team player. And speaking of being a team player, let's discuss the unspoken expectations that come with startup jobs. You're expected to be available 24/7, to work weekends when there's a deadline, to take on responsibilities that have nothing to do with your job description, and to do it all with a smile because you're living the dream. The mentorship and learning opportunities that startups promise are largely mythical too. Your boss is probably 25 years old and has no more experience than you do. The senior leadership is too busy putting out fires to provide meaningful guidance. The company is changing direction so frequently that any skills you develop might be irrelevant by the time you master them. The most insidious part of all this is how the startup industry has convinced people that traditional employment is somehow beneath them. They've created this narrative where working for an established company with actual HR policies and reasonable work-life balance makes you a sellout or someone who lacks ambition. Meanwhile, the people peddling this narrative are the same ones who will fire you via Slack message to preserve their own salaries. The data doesn't lie. The average startup employee changes jobs every 18 months, not because they're climbing some career ladder, but because their company either failed or laid them off. The average startup employee earns less than their counterparts at established companies, works longer hours, and has significantly less job security. The promise of equity compensation rarely materializes into actual wealth. Yet somehow, we've created an entire generation of workers who think this is normal, who think that suffering for your job is noble, who think that work-life balance is for people who lack vision. The startup industrial complex has successfully convinced people that their exploitation is actually empowerment. The reality is that most startup jobs are just regular jobs with worse benefits, longer hours, and fancy job titles that don't mean anything outside of the company. You're not disrupting anything. You're not changing the world, and you're probably not going to get rich. You're just working for a small company that might not exist next year, doing tasks that could probably be automated for less money than you could make somewhere else. So here's the bottom line. Startup jobs aren't the golden ticket everyone pretends they are. They're regular jobs with worse benefits, longer hours, and a fancy title that means nothing outside the building. You're not disrupting anything, you're not changing the world, and you're definitely not getting rich. You're just another employee at a company that might disappear tomorrow, working for people who will fire you over Slack to save their own skin. Stop falling for the hype and start demanding better.